So yeah, it's great to be back for the lecture. Just as a brief thing, when we were putting the book together, as you know, the Apollo mission, which also includes all the other missions to get men on the moon, and then afterwards we talk a little bit about the shuttle. But as you know, it's immense. The program is absolutely immense on that. So we try to break it down into three kind of areas. One is to try to get the context of the people that were not familiar with the Apollo program, and also reaching back a little bit in the history. We felt this was important because the University of Preston, Florida wanted this to be as a people's book. They did not want it to be as a textbook or highly scientific on that end, which was always a challenge for us, both myself being a preservationist and an architect, and Beth being an archaeologist, and Lisa is also an archaeologist as well. So we broke it down into three. That first in the context, setting the historic. The second, to identify those sites that are at risk or have disappeared and why they are important to the overall feeling. And then the third item is some success that we've had in saving sites and what the future holds from us. So we're going to give this more of a capsulated, quick overview in terms of the presentation today, and hopefully we'll have enough if you would like to ask questions. As you know, we've got a couple more years to celebrate the 50th year for Armstrong stepping on the moon, so there's a lot of books coming out now, a lot of astronauts are writing books and stuff, so we were very fortunate following actually about a 6-year journey on this. We had a very large symposium for the American Archaeological Society in Honolulu, and we gave presentations. I think there's about 9 of us, or 8 or 9 of us, that gave presentations on this. Springer got a hold of it, so we did the Springer book, and then we had a battle from your old campus, University of New Mexico, State University of New Mexico, and the University of Preston, Florida, wanting to do this book. So we're very fortunate that we had this, and we've had really a lot of good time. We had a book signing at the National Air and Space Museum, and it was really a lot of fun when you're in that kind of environment. And I was also here when Apollo 9 was delivered, so that was kind of fun. Anyway, I'd like to introduce Beth O'Leary. She's going to take the first half, and then...
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's unfortunate our other colleague, Lisa Westwood, couldn't be here because she was really important in putting this book together. I want to talk a little bit about space archaeology. In space archaeology, we focus our gaze into the heavens. So it's the view from Earth into space. It's not a new perspective. People have been looking at the heavens and the night sky forever. Next.
Could you please speak up? Speak really loud.
Sure. Okay, I'll use my teacher voice, okay?
There you go.
All cultures are fascinated with the celestial bodies in the night sky. And so we have been looking up in the night sky for as long as we have been humans. Depending on who you talk to, that could be 40,000 years. We include celestial bodies in our rituals, our calendars, and our stories. Outer space is a place where memories are stored. And it's never had any artifacts until the last 60 years. Space is not a vacuum. It's part of the cultural landscape of the Earth. So our work today looks at the exploration of space, and especially on the moon, from an archaeological and a historical preservation perspective. Next slide. So what is space archaeology and heritage? Well, a good definition of archaeology is the study of the patterns of relationships between material culture and human behavior. There are no spatial boundaries. Humans now have an exo-atmospheric presence, so there's an archaeological record in space and on the celestial bodies as well as on Earth. And it is a very recent past. Space archaeology looks at the human engagement with space, which is distributed across the whole Earth in orbit and on other celestial bodies. It encompasses a huge assemblage, and I wish the book were bigger, but it would have taken us another 6 years to include everything. There are materials that were created on Earth, but at a certain point in time and a certain stage of development, they entered the archaeological record somewhere else. In its widest sense, we study material culture on Earth that are related to all activities in space. For example, Voyager 1 is a human artifact that is now farthest from Earth. Recently got a boost in November with some thrusters, and it is now 21 billion kilometers from Earth. Launched in 1977, it left our solar system in 2012 and is now in interstellar space. It carries with it symbolic messages from Earth and will have a close approach to a star, Gliese 445, in another 40,000 years. That's a long way out. Its power will no longer exist in 2020. Next. I love talking to this audience because as I look around, you guys watch this like I did on TV. Some of us, like Justin, have to see it on YouTube. So this is a very famous site that you might remember seeing on July 20th, 1969. And this particular image is a recent one, and that was taken by the LRO in 2009. And it gives archaeologists a remote view of the configuration and the content of the Apollo 11 lunar landing site at Tranquility Base. And I'm going to keep referring to it as Tranquility Base. It's not quite at the resolution an archaeologist would like, but remote sensing like this, which has been in use since the 1970s, is a potent tool for archaeologists when they want to look at places that are very hard to get to. So we study the near past by looking at the significance of places and the archaeological formation processes of discard, loss, and abandonment. There are both natural and cultural forces that affect archaeological sites. In our book, The Final Mission, we look at some of the places on Earth related to the development of space exploration, from manufacturing facilities to launch sites. We focus mainly on the United States, and especially on California and New Mexico, where we're both from. They're all related in a huge cultural landscape. They are the product of many separate minds and large-scale international cooperation. Our space heritage is humanity's technological heritage, and it demonstrates technological intelligence at a particular historical era. And the time of space exploration is really embedded in the Cold War. Next. I started this because a student in 2000, Ralph Gibson, asked me, does federal preservation law apply on the moon? It's one of those great questions you get and you don't know the answer, so I immediately said, let's try to get some funding from NASA. And we got a grant from the New Mexico Space Grant Consortium, not enough to go back to the moon, but we started focusing on the Tranquility Base landing site. I met Lisa Westwood, our colleague, and Wayne Donaldson, who at the time was the California SHPO, and we all worked together to place the artifacts and structures at Tranquility Base on the moon on 2 state registers of cultural properties. Our work early on brought attention to the cultural resources of space. We focused on Tranquility Base because it was the most iconic of all the sites. People were very interested in what was left up there. So we have prosaic items like empty food bags, emesis bags, cast off over shoes, an olive branch, and a disc containing messages from world leaders. It's important to remember that space is imbued with the values that are encapsulated in the histories, the objects, and the places. And it really begs further study. Next one. Tranquility Base is an archaeological site. As space archaeologists and preservationists, we work with the documentary record, but we provide a unique perspective by examining the material culture, the features, the artifacts, the places. And there are other Apollo sites as well, of course, as well as earlier Russian and American robotic sites. Landing on the moon was the product of many people working at thousands of facilities where they researched and developed the technology that made going to the moon possible. As archaeologists and preservationists, we can study what we call the Apollo culture, the artifacts and features that the Apollo astronauts left on the moon. These objects stopped being part of the active context and entered the archaeological realm when the astronauts left the lunar surface. There are some exceptions. The lunar laser ranging retroreflector is still being used for many of the polar suns. As archaeologists and preservationists, we can ask questions about the Apollo culture. Were the approaches to space different in the Soviet Union versus the US? How did the common requirements to survive in space override those cultural differences? And how did the material culture of Apollo change through time? Studying material culture can reveal motivations, national ideologies, beliefs, and customs. So we decided to write this book to look at some of the places that were very important to the Apollo program in the history of space exploration. Okay, next one. Well, the most critical way of determining significance in preservation is to look at the historic context of the material culture. Wayne and I will look at the space age and its origins briefly. And in the US, Robert Goddard was one of the early rocket pioneers, beginning in 1910 when he tested a liquid fuel rocket on his farm in Auburn, Massachusetts, later moving to Roswell where he did more tests. That rocket moved into warfare, and one example of a very important space heritage object is the V-2 rocket. At the end of World War II, the US and the Soviet Union competed for German rockets and German rocket scientists. And Wernher von Braun and his team were brought to White Sands, New Mexico. And essentially the V-2 became our first military missile. Later, its descendants launched the first satellites and brought the first humans to the moon. So the Cold War was played out not only on the surface of the Earth, but in space as well. Launch Complex 33 at White Sands Missile Range, where much of the early testing happened, is now a national landmark. Next. In 57, 58, yes?
I just have a quick question. You may cover it later, but I think it was Apollo 12 landed very close to the Surveyor 3 landing site and actually recovered some parts of that. Are you going to cover that, or is?
Well, I should, but I don't have a slide. But let me tell you, I thought I was the first space archaeologist, and I was wrong. Because Alan Bean and Pete Conrad went on 12, landed within several hundred yards of Surveyor 3, and did essentially an archaeological study. So I'd nominate them for the space archaeology.
You're still the queen.
Thanks.
So what did they bring back? What did they learn?
They brought back a camera, they brought back some tubing, they brought back some streptococcus bacteria that was sneezed on from the camera, and essentially looked at the materials and the effects of space on them. They landed about a year and a half after the survey.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is an archaeological survey. Well, in 57, 58, we know that Sputnik went up, and then several months later, a small unfortunate dog named Laika went up in Sputnik 2. Those Russian satellites deorbited soon after they were launched. But again, the Russians beat us into space. The US had a lot of failures, and they were referred to in the press as flopniks and kaputniks, but we succeeded in 58 with Explorer 1. And then the most famous one, next, Vanguard. Vanguard is the grapefruit-sized satellite which only weighs about 4.4 kilograms, and is the sole survivor of the early days. It was launched in 1958, and it is still orbiting in space today. It even has its own website, so we know it must be important. And it is predicted by NASA to be there for another 600 years. It is essentially an object that is preserved in situ by its relatively long, stable orbit. And it is currently the oldest artifact in space. It is an artifact that is more than its amazing technological side. It was an ideological weapon, and it combined the peaceful and scientific uses of space, as well as an artifact that had to demonstrate a capacity by the US and the free world against communism. Next.
Yeah. There's a website, or I'm sorry, an application that you can get on your phone that you can, and it will tell you when Vanguard's coming over.
Well, I should get that from
You
you.
can actually see it at night. Plus the International Space Station and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Well, the Russians used vacuum tubes for their to broadcasting, and we used our chips, transistors, but we sent a stronger signal than they did. They call it a grapefruit nick.
Well, here's something I want to talk about. I'm going to get to Arizona, which is close to us here. But to understand the significance of artifacts that are important in space history, we need to look at the space race model within the Cold War. So there was a strong emphasis on the technological achievements in the U.S. in relationship to the USSR, especially satellites. And there's one very little known important site in Arizona I want to talk about in the next couple of slides, but I need to give you the backstory. So during the Cold War, it was vital, as their relationship deteriorated, that the U.S. needed to know the technology that the Russians had in terms of missiles. And there was great secrecy at that time about the development of nuclear weapons, which made it almost impossible to negotiate any agreements to limit missile capabilities. So we created the U-2 spy planes, and they provided some of the first images of the USSR military facilities. And this program worked, as you know, under secrecy during President Eisenhower, and he had deep fears about flying over Soviet airspace. It worked until Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot, was shot down in May of 1960. The Corona program ramped up at that point, and it included groups of scientists, academics, manufacturers, the Department of Defense, and the intelligence community. And it was the beginnings, really, of the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Organization. And during its lifetime, the Corona gathered more than 800,000 images of Russia, China, and other countries. And many believe that the Corona program provided intelligence that prevented a nuclear war. Next. There was a multi-level cooperation for the Corona, which really resulted in several technological advances in rocketry, orbital mechanics, earth sciences, and imagery that provides the basis for today's global mapping, what you were talking about earlier. How many of us use GPS? How many of us needed Google Earth to get to a restaurant last night? So the development of Corona made these modern innovations possible. The launches were from Vandenberg Air Force Base with a Thor booster and an Athena rocket. And this program had many firsts. It ran from about 1959 to 1972. The most incredible success was the first time an object was actually retrieved from orbit. I became aware of the Corona because one of my colleagues at Smithsonian, Hannah Szepanowska, was working on a Corona camera that was given to the Smithsonian. And in 1995, when the program was declassified, the NRO transferred this KH-4B camera, which is one of the latest ones, and it achieved a resolution as high as 6 feet. So you could see something 6 feet on a side. But by its covert nature, the destruction and slow declassification of all the records, it presented many challenges to her and the curators. The camera needed conservation and had its first and foremost photo documentation at that time. Corona was the first successful space-based imagery collection platform. It has critical artifacts that exemplify the technological development of space, and past CIA Director Helms wanted Americans, quote, to view it and the men who built it like the Wright brothers for the role they played in history. Well, to get back to Arizona. If you've been to Casa Grande, Arizona, it's a very flat basin, and it's a huge archaeological site. It has a series of flat, concrete Maltese crosses, which covers an area of 256 square miles. The crosses are arranged in a 16 by 16 mile grid, and each individual cross is a calibration mark for the Corona Spy satellite camera. There are some 270 of these marks. Some of them no longer exist, others are in good shapes, and others are crumbling. And they are within various land designations. Some are on private land, federal land, Native American land, and state land. There's been a good deal of research done about the camera, certainly at Vandenberg and various rockets, but little on this particular site. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built these crosses and placed a descriptive metal marker in the center of each one of them. But there are a lot of questions about how they were used and the significance of this site. Is it tied to the USGS plating? How was the grid laid out? Were local materials and contractors involved? And were there areas of conflict between the community of Casa Grande and the landowners and the federal government? And given the condition of these, and it's over now 50 years old, should we be recording and preserving these for future generations? Next. Well, I worked with two photographers, Julie Anand and Damon Sauer at the University of Arizona, and they plotted the current trajectory of some of the major satellites at the site. There are thousands of trajectories and others who are not depicted or unknown. And as you know, there's a lot of space junk currently in Earth orbit and in geostationary. Well, the exquisite nature and context of these photos and the juxtaposition of the satellite orbits really point to an increase in the world's connection and reliance on the use of satellites and space. Next. Based on the Encyclopedia Britannica Book of the Year my husband gave me, documenting successful launches from October 1960 to 1961, there were a total of 35 satellites placed into orbit, 27 from the US and 8 from the USSR. 11 of those 27 were the Corona. 4 of the Corona missions were unsuccessful. If we were to superimpose a plot of satellite trajectories launched by the USSR and the US for 1960, it would just be a small fraction of all the things that are up there today. Today's life is unimaginable without the involvement of satellites for exploration, for weather tracking, and for all communication. These cultural resources are very important, and they're part of the space age, and they deserve our consideration as space heritage. And they need to be preserved in some way, by documentation, photographing, and actually creating areas that exemplify what happened at these places. So my plea as an archaeologist is that we need to think about our space heritage now. It seems recent. I know many of you were involved at the early stages of space exploration, but it's time to figure out an agenda to preserve things that we find significant. I'm going to turn it over to Lynn.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I know you're in preserving things in space, but are we going to reach a point where we need to get rid of things in space because there's too much stuff up there?
Absolutely, because the point is you have to determine what is significant, what's important, and for safety reasons, what isn't. So the orbital debris, as you all know, is a real problem now. And in the beginning, we never thought about that. We didn't think about it. It was just amazing to get a satellite up. But now, with collisions, with space junk interfering with other space junk, the International Space Station being evacuated several times, we need to think about what do we need to preserve that's important. Vanguard, to me, is really a big thing. I mean, it's a significant grapefruit. But there are other bits and pieces and gloves and little paint chips that are not. So again, we need to have a very broad approach, and it has to be international too, because we're not the only ones up there anymore. But I'll turn it over to Wayne.
Thank you.
Okay.
Actually, that's a great question. In Honolulu, one of our authors that's in the Springer book, I don't know whether the Springer book is still in print or not,
Yes.
gave a whole presentation on the space junk and the problems and how you try to capture it and how all of that. So, all right. So we're going to come back to Earth a little bit, although we've just been on Earth, and I want to go over some of these. But first of all, I'd like to ask you a question. I was fortunate enough to be in Tomorrowland in Disneyland when Armstrong stepped on the moon with about 2,000 people, and now I can go on YouTube And although I haven't found myself there yet, it's amazing that that whole event was highly photographed at Disneyland. So how many people watched it on at least TV, of course? All right, great. So, you know, us that get in our mid-70s, we've seen that stuff, huh? All right, so I've also been blessed, let's go to the next slide. I've also been blessed as being the State Historic Preservation Officer and serving under 2 governors, and then also as the chairman of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which oversees all of the other federal agencies to make sure they're keeping good care of their historical resources. And we deal with probably about 92 federal agencies, and 47 of them are quite strong, besides Department of Interior, Department of Defense, and all of those. So I've been blessed that I've had a chance to be at many of these sites and not only talk to the people and tour them, but also get a lot of inside stories, which I'll relate some of those to you. So normally when we're talking about a space site or a space launch site or whatever, Cape Canaveral, of course, is the one that almost everybody always thinks of. But to go back, what Beth was saying is that this began as a military operation, and of course, it's an installation in the United States Air Force Command 45th Space Wing, which I really thought was a great name that they put it there. And as most of you know, this also became Cape Kennedy following the assassination of President Kennedy from 63 to 73, and then came back as Cape Canaveral to the present. And it's again southeast of the NASA's Kennedy Space Center, which a lot of them kind of get confused on that. I was given a tour of this, which was really great, just before they've sort of closed it now to most of the general public. You have to get really special permission to do that. But a number of firsts were launched from this place, including the first Earth satellite in 1958, the first U.S. astronauts in 61, first astronaut in orbit, of course, 62, and you can just go on and on. But it's also being very active. Besides of the SpaceX program, it was also the first to orbit and land on Venus, 78, orbit Saturn in 2004, Mercury in 2011, and the first spacecraft to leave the solar system in 1977. So to kind of echo what Beth is saying is that we're in a continuum of looking at these sites, and as most of you know, Balboa Park was ready to be demolished right after the fair in 1916. The only thing that was to remain was going to be the Balboa Tower, the Oregon Pavilion, and the building behind the Oregon Pavilion. Every house, every one of the other buildings was going to be demolished and was going to be turned into a landscape. And thank God for the women in preservation came forward and preserved and saved it. Because remember, when I worked on the House of Hospitality, the plaster that was there was staff plaster. It was meant for the interior, because the building was only to last 1 year, and then we extended another year to 1916. All of the foundations were wood blocks with wood posts on them. There was no concrete at all down there. Everything was racked and cracked and everything else. So over the years now, we preserved this park, and we would have never had it. And thank God we had the 35 Exposition, which built the Ford building that we have here. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had it. Including saving these unique things like the murals that we have in the Ford building that most of you remember after the bad fire that we had that burned a lot of the stuff down, including a lot of my friend's stuff and my friend's father's stuff that was there. You know, the mural was all deteriorated from all the stuff. So the preservation that we're talking about is we can't wait to save old stuff anymore. And that's what really irritates me about the National Register is you have this 50-year mark. But we're looking at things now that are exceptional and moving on with this. Next one. Had a chance to go to Langley. I don't have some pictures here. We try to condense this one. But the variable density tunnel in Langley was built in 1921. And it was interesting that the National Advisory Committee in Aeronautics, which was called NACA at the time before it became NASA, built a variety of these technical resources all over for the facilities. And I don't know, have any of you been to Langley to see the variable density tunnel there? Well, it's a cylinder probably about another half the length of this room here, and it looks like something out of Jules Verne. It looks like an underground submarine. It's round and cylindrical with round ends, gigantic rivets like this. So they can basically change the density in there to understand how it was. So in 1945, we had the lead in aviation but it seemed to be evaporating a little bit as the German missiles and other things came up. So the unitary plan Winnell Tunnel, which is which was built in 1956. Now, in 1956, this tunnel cost $26 million. So you can imagine the amount of money that we were pouring in as the United States to do this. And since its completion, this has been probably the most heavy NASA wind tunnel in all of the states. Every major commercial transport, almost every military jet built in the United States over the last 40 years has been tested in this facility, including Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo spacecraft and space stones. This has now been sitting here empty for many years. There was a movement to tear it down because what are you going to do with a wind tunnel that's like this now when everything is so heavily computerized and much more better designed than what you would now find by building full-size models and putting in there. I came up with the concept of put a few little slit windows in there and turn it into a live environment like we do with old buildings downtown and everything. Wouldn't it be great to say that you live in the world's largest wind tunnel? But anyway, it's preserved for right now, including Hangar 1, which we also had to save. Hangar 1 was coming down. It was the last clamshell built in 1935 metal hangar. After the war started, of course, anything that was out of metal turned into another substitute material, so we could build our tanks and guns and bullets and everything else. So all the ones that you normally see, the large limb hangers and stuff, were made out of wood. Let's go on. We also met some interesting characters and had a chance to study. This is Lieutenant Colonel John Stapp, and he is sitting on the 2,000-foot rocket sled at Edwards Air Force Base. And Justin joined me and some others out there to walk through, which is really great because we get into areas that no normal person would get in, and seeing a lot of like fake planes that they used to build and stuff like that. And but most of you, how many of you have been to Edwards Air Force Base? Okay, great. So about 5 or 6 of you. Again, it's kind of northeast of Lancaster and east of Rosamond. If any of you, of course, fly over, sometimes you can get permission to fly over it when there's no activity, which is really great, and take a look down. I wanted to land an L5 there because I had some work that I was doing there. I had Marines on the side, and they said no way, so I thought that was kind of strange. But anyway, I had a chance to do that, but it never really happened. Again, it's the home of the Air Force Test Center and the Air Force Material Command. It's also the home to NASA's Armstrong Flight Research Center. The unique thing, though, that I really found out here is the 2,000-foot thing that was built by Northrop in 1944. And the whole purpose of this initially was to kind of test V-2 rockets that were captured and everything else. But Lieutenant John Stapp came in and decided to do experiments first on chimpanzees in order to see how the human could take acceleration and deceleration and figure out how this works. And at that time, of course, to use chimpanzees was okay. It would probably not go over too well today. But he sort of gave up and couldn't really get the feel. And of course, the chimps wouldn't talk to him. So he decided to strap himself in this thing. So it was interesting because this track and a lot of the materials of the track was then moved over to Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, where he decided to do it. And on December 10th, 1954, in 5 seconds, he went to 632 miles per hour in 5 seconds. So you think you're trying to really go fast getting on the freeway, you know, in your Corvette? Try that. And then he came to a stop in 1.4 seconds. So that's far. Now this is something that Beth and I keep talking about. He is reported to pull, because he had a G meter on, 46 Gs. Now most of you know from 8 to 10 Gs you pass out. 46 Gs is incredible. He had broken ribs, detached retina. But anyway, he learned a lot. He was also called fastest man on earth or the bravest man in the Air Force. But the nice thing is that track is still there, going through the Mojave Desert, all of the pads where the chimpanzee was, and everything else. And again, it is sort of like archaeology. But if that ever gets paved over or grown over or anything else, then everybody's going to be 50 years from now discovering this stuff, and that's why we want to try to raise the conscience next. This is at Langley. It's the Rendezvous Docking Simulator, which is very cool. It has a whole bunch of gimbals in there that you can then hang full-size scale models of the vehicles that are going to be used in space on this. Most of you remember the movie Apollo 13 where Tom Hanks was playing Jim Lovell. And as they're in the LIM trying to do the maneuvers, he was all over the map because the controls were reversible. In other words, he'd go right and go left and all that sort of stuff. And part of that training was to focus on the only thing that's stationary in space, which was the Earth. And if you remember, once he said that and focused on it, that's where he got the training, is in this place. Next. So it also allowed them to practice the docking stations, again full size, using, again, compressed air to move the capsules around in order to meet and come up. So I really felt that this is pretty cool. Next. We call this a big erector set. This was a lunar landing resource facility, again at Langley. And it has now been abandoned. They've done some, the last time they did some testings was about 12 years ago. It's been abandoned, it's slowly kind of rusting, and again, you know, what do you do with it when you no longer need it? But it was used by NASA to train the Apollo astronauts to fly in a simulated lunar environment. Neil Armstrong, at Aldrin, 22 other astronauts used this as they would pilot the last 150 feet down. And as most of you remember seeing the thing on Apollo 11 coming down, you know, Armstrong had to take over from the computers and basically fly it down with 42 seconds left of fuel in order to do that. Next. And this is where they simulated. This happens to be a time-lapse photograph of the LIM coming down for landing, and this is piloted by Armstrong. So again, these things are really unique. And just think, if you're a fourth grader and you're trying to understand, go back to the last slide, and you're bringing a fourth grader out here explaining this to them, they're not going to get it. They just won't put it together. But if you had at least a photograph or a simulation or part of the LIM hanging from there, then they'll start to get it, just like you guys when you put on the exhibits here. Next. All right, so these are the things that have really not only excited me, but upset me over the years. As most of you know, with the decrease of the program that we have a tremendous amount of these resources that are just left and abandoned. And one of the problems is that you talk to risk managers, as you guys probably know all the time, and everything else, and the danger of this, a lot of the toxic stuff that's in the ground and everything else. And this happens to be the engine hot fire testing on Alpha Test Dam in Santa Susana Field Laboratory. Has anybody ever worked there or been there? All right, these are one of the places where you go, and as soon as you leave, you've got to tell somebody about this place because it is phenomenal. There's over 160 facilities there, including the buildings and everything else. It was started in 1947. It was first, the first group to move in was Rocketdyne, normally, again, a division of North American Aviation, and was successfully looking at reliable liquid rocket engines. Again, because you can't use solid liquid fuel when you get to space, of course, because you don't have any oxygen to burn in there. And besides the Redstone rocket, the Thor and the Jupiters and the ballistic missiles and everything, it also became part of the Atomics International Division of North American Aviation to look at doing compressed and first commercial nuclear power plants in the States. So besides just looking at testing rockets, now when you test these rockets, when the Saturn V rocket test was done, you have to emulate the entire rocket. You can't just fire off the cones and stuff and that, so they have to load it with all of the other stuff to look at vibration, movements, and side movements and everything else, see how the computers are going and everything else. So these are full-blown tests before they're put on a rocket and sent up. These things are 50 stories tall, some of them.
Didn't they make a couple of movies using this as a set?
They did, yeah. I think they made 4 movies.
Yeah, I
on this.
remember
Yeah.
a couple of them.
And
That's located where?
in Santa Susana, now this is a unique thing. When I'm talking, we had a group of about 50 workers that were there. And these guys were all in their 20s, and now they're all in their 70s like me. And we brought them up there, And it was interesting talking because when we told him what was happening, he says, it's like tearing down our high school. This is where we learned everything. This is where we invented stuff that nobody was really thinking of. So when I was talking to him, I said, well, where did you guys normally live? They said, well, we lived in Van Nuys and all that because the Santa Susana field, which is very similar to where Von Braun was actually doing his experiments, because you needed to have these very rugged hillsides so that the exhaust would then flow down. You could not test these things on a flat surface. So you had to have a way to do that. You had to have a way to wash the chemicals away after that time because they're very caustic. It would cause skin burns and everything else. So the whole setup was like this, and it was isolated. So it's north of Van Nuys in the mountains. It was a no-fly zone for many, many years. You could not fly over that. There was twin fences and patrolled all the time and everything else. But at night, I was told by the guys, you'd have this red glow over the mountains, and you could actually hear some of it, but nobody really knew what it was happening. A lot of the rocket engines and stuff were delivered from Colorado and set up in here where they were made. So this is a humongous facility, and on the enclosure, it's been determined that there's 3 historic sites and over 120 contributing resources here. We're going to keep 1. That was the mitigation. 1 tower. And my attitude is we should treat these things like the Europeans treat their older buildings. When I was in Uppsala for 2 years, I'd walk down the road, there would be a ruined church. The walls are there and everything else. I mean, you can walk inside. I mean, you know, there's no roof on it and everything else, but it's still there as a ruin. And treat it as a ruin, keep people off, you know, keep them out of the fall zone and all that. But if you ever have been at a place like this, it's incredible. You just can't stop talking about it. So in 1966, the Boeing company, who was then the primary owner of that, decided to close the site, and now we're going to completely dispose of it, which is a little bit sad, but that's just the way it is. It's interesting when you look at the pillbox and everything else. If you can imagine when you're looking at a rocket, and these are all test stands. Nothing ever flew off of there, of course. These are all test stands. But when you're looking at behind a wall that's 3 foot thick, and the glass is 1.5 foot thick, and that's what your observation pillbox is looking at. And you're looking across a canyon. In other words, it's like going across the freeway down here. That's how far you're looking, because people just didn't know what was going to happen in terms of an explosion. Next. Okay, so we also have some really great stuff that's done here. This is at UCSD at the NASA lab, and it's the Department of Medicine, the Division of Physiology, which is really cool. And what they've been doing for years and years and years is studying the lung in the absence of gravity. And the only way that they could do this, again, is to get in an aircraft, usually a C-9 or a KC-135, and come up, and we've all done this in our planes, you know, where you have your passenger next to you, and you got your little pin here, and you do this, and you let go of the pin, and it just stays there for 2 or 3 seconds. Well, this was 25 to 30 seconds that you would have in zero gravity here. So then they would test that, how the lung's performing, and everything else. And on June 15th of this year, NASA honored UCSD Alan Hagrans for his research on astronaut health and performance. How many people knew this facility existed up at UCSD? See? Okay, now I know the next one, you know. Sorry about the slide, this is taken off the internet. Where is this?
Sycamore Canyon.
Sycamore Canyon, all right. So Sycamore Canyon is just up the road near Miramar, and it was only a rockets and weapon testing site. Again, nothing was launched from here, but it's where they tested the rockets. And again, it was part of the Lockheed Martin, the Hughes aircraft, General Dynamics, and it was for use as the first successful test of the Atlas missile test. Yes, sure. Yeah, right here. And this was in August 29th of 1956 when that test was done, which was the very, very first successful test. It's interesting because Kaiser Shipbuilding did all the construction and installation, and massive steel frame, and all of that. And if you are interested, thank God to YouTubes and everything else, there's people that sneak in here, and they basically video this. And one guy actually got to the underground here, so he's crawling through the underground like Beth and I have done elsewhere, shooting this video stuff. All the stuff is there, all the placards and the machinery and the desk and pencils and paper. And it's just like they walked out the door, locked it up, and it's all there. We were lucky at Santa Susana because we saved all that stuff. And I've had the fortune, to do a lot of this. I don't know if you remember the variable angle tester that we did for torpedoes. That was up above the hills in, my mind's going away from now, down in Los Angeles. Azusa on that in Morris Dam. And it was interesting because we tried to say that all came down. We had to do the HABS drawings, Historic American Building Survey drawings, on that before we took it down. But one of my guys took a sign that was there that says, "Do not drop torpedoes." You would just think that would be the natural, but these things are really great because they tell the story, especially in the way they're done with the graphics and everything else. Next. By the way, it's still there and it's been abandoned. Okay, so why are we looking at this and what tools do we have to say this? Well, we have the American Antiquities Act in 1906. It is, of course, being challenged desperately by this current administration on this. But one of the things of that act, and then the later one, the National Historic Preservation Act of '66, we did not really have an act at that time in terms of the preservation. The way this came was that the federal government, using our federal monies, was building freeways primarily. And as you know, this Freeway 5 cuts right through downtown San Diego. And the reason why it cut through there is because that's where most of the abandoned homes were done, some of the buildings were done, people didn't have much money. You look at San Bernardino, you look at San Francisco, you look at Los Angeles, they all say the same story under the Eisenhower Infrastructure Build-Up Program. And the people that brought this forward were not preservationists. They were the mayors, the National Association of Mayors in the United States, because their towns were being ripped apart. So the National Historic Preservation Act came in 50 years ago in 1966 to make sure that when federal agencies are spending funds or they're issuing permits like BLM does out in the desert, or they own properties like DOD or GSA or some of these places, that they recognize how important this is. We started under my leadership called In the Spirit of Stewardship, where now we're celebrating what they're doing, and they then present us a report. NASA gives us a report, Department of Defense gives a report, and it comes on once every 3 years now on what they're doing and how they do it. Okay, so we're going to move to this one. We're not sure if this is going to work. Let me explain it first before you press the button. What we're trying to do now, we're back at Santa Susana. And thank God for the drones and all that sort of stuff now, because now we're trying to record these properties. Again, we're going to have problems with the method that we're having and how we're going to play it later on in the future, but I think I always get a good feeling when I saw Men in Black, the first one, and I don't know if you remember when Tommy Lee Jones held up the little thing, he says, "Oh, I'm going to have to buy the White Album again from the Beatles," you know. So I think the technology will still follow us on this, but this is now recording what you're seeing at this, and if you can imagine these 50-story buildings and everything else, these test stands that you have and everything, and of course, what do you do with the test stand? You know, some of the things in terms of cleaning up the mess, we're going to have to dig down 30 feet to clean the soil up. But let's see if this will work. If it doesn't work, then you're going to have to go online. It's looking better. Can you go full size?
Sure.
Okay, now this is again done with GPS and infill, so it's going to look a little bit sketchy on the fringes because the fringes kind of go away. So it's meant to then now be a Google flyover, and again you can see the helium tanks that you see here, and now you're kind of walking through. This is one of the observation towers, so you're looking across this thick glass and thick walls. So you're looking across the canyon to the launch test sites. That's here. And again, you need to have this so that the exhaust can come. And again, just like with the launches, you keep the helium and oxygen tanks separated because when they combine, they tend to do their number. So if you can imagine just walking through a canyon like Yosemite and then just seeing these humongous structures and signs and notes and stuff just all over the place, because when these are abandoned, again, the people that work there, they can't take it with them. You know, remember us pushing over all the Mustangs and stuff off of the carriers and everything else at the end of World War II and everything else. Now we wish we had more, but that's what happens. We just tend to scrap these things out. So I think you can get a feel for this place, and it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
Where is it?
Again, north of Van Nuys. If you just look at a map, you'll see the Santa Susana Hills. In other words, if you're coming down 5, let's say you're coming down 5 and you go through, before you start to go through Magic Mountain and all that area, it's over to the right. It's over to the right.
There's that highway that goes from Magic Mountain over to the coast. Is it all along that highway?
No, there's no highway or anything that goes through it.
So it's
you
east-
can't see it from any highway.
So-
You actually have to drive to this site.
So it's east of,
It's north of Van Nuys, it's west of 5 coming down, and it's east of 101, I guess, or whatever that
Okay.
area would be.
Is this the one where you drive through, like, housing to get to it?
Yeah, you do. So part of that. And also the Chumash, there's very important sites there, which is really neat. They have one tower that's right near a Chumash site where the stone is kind of curved, so the sun comes through, and they painted all these red circles on the maps. The site's figured about maybe 8,000 years old on it. Okay, that's enough.
Well, who owns it? What organization owns it?
NASA.
NASA.
And Boeing has almost taken all theirs down. Now what do we do? Just go forward.
You just close that.
Go
browser.
forward.
Close the browser.
No, close it down.
This?
Yeah. Cool. Now go forward. All right, another success is the Barstow College now is going to take the Pioneer Deep Station tower here, and they're going to put it in the center of their classrooms. Isn't that cool, the way they've designed that? So it's going to be there. It is a National Historic Landmark, so it'll be removed from sight, so it'll no longer be a National Historic Landmark, but at least it'll be saved. It was constructed in 1958. It was the first antenna to support NASA's unmanned exploration of deep space, which is really going to be kind of cool when they set this up. And you can, again, look at the scale. There's a person. Look at the person here, the scale from here to here. So a lot of times nobody really sees the scale when you just see it in pictures. Next. All right, as Beth has said, and I'm not gonna read all this stuff that we went through. I did bring one of the applications. The neat thing is when Lisa and Beth walked into my office, and I don't know who turned to who. I think Beth turned to Lisa and said, well, this is gonna be easy. And I said, well, first of all, who are you, and why is this going to be so easy? And I had the limb, one of these great models sitting on my desk at the time. So anyway, they said, well, we have been back to the National Park Service, and because nobody can own the moon, is that we have the problem of they won't even entertain us nominating us. And part of this movement, with Lisa and Beth and now myself included, is to have the moon as a World Heritage Site in cooperation with all the other nations that contributed to this. Because besides just Russia having some stuff, all the nations, and Beth's going to talk about that in just a second, have been involved in this program. And to me, putting man on the moon, you know, you can always argue for, you know, the 20th century, what is the most unique? Well, the computer may be for social, for sure. Manhattan Project, absolutely, for the ending the war and everything else. But I think putting man on the moon, another celestial body, has got to be the greatest technological achievement of the 20th century. So anyway, we decided that, I said, well, let's see if we can't put it on the California Register of Historic Places. And so I went to my boss at that time, and she just went bananas. Told me I'm going to be on the Jon Stewart show, dressed up as an astronaut. The governor's not going to approve this, yada, yada, yada. You know, well, we did. We got nominated. It was a landslide. And then we got messages from all over the world. Everywhere. Germany, China, everything else, including those kooks out there that said we never were there. They wrote letters to the governor. I had to go meet with Schwarzenegger and say, this is really okay, it's not a problem. And then we put on the register. So I'm going to let Beth take over the next one. Just briefly, and then we got one more slide and we're done.
Well, to my mind, no one has ever questioned the importance or the significance of the Tranquility-based site on the moon. My students and myself first proposed in 2000 nominating it as a National Historic Landmark under the National Historic Preservation Act to NASA and the keeper of the register. And you know it's going to be bad when you get a letter from their lawyer. So they both rejected that. They didn't think that anything on the moon, the Tranquility Base should be on the National Register as a National Historic Landmark. But it does qualify under all the criteria. It meets them all, except it's not in the United States. This attitude changed a decade later. I was invited to be part of a team that NASA put together of scientists and another historian to help write the guidelines. And in 2011, NASA created guidelines, recommendations to spacefaring entities to preserve U.S. lunar sites. There's the website up there. So they set aside the first and the last Apollo sites as the two most important ones. And you should notice also that these are recommendations and guidelines. They're not legally binding. But they do put on record that NASA has changed and that has a commitment to preserving the scientific and historic value of all artifacts. I had a lot of trouble convincing them to use the word artifact. They liked equipment and junk, but they are artifacts. I believe we will go back to the moon, and it's going to happen soon. I think there are many teams competing now for the Google Lunar X Prize. But it's not only the United States that should be involved in lunar preservation and our space heritage, because I really feel that space heritage belongs to humanity. Its preservation has to be international, and there are many more players than they're from the 60s. There are over 50 nation states that have a presence in space. And on the moon, Russia has robotic sites and currently performs 50% of all the commercial launches into space. Others include the European Space Agency, which has a robotic crash landing on the moon in 2006. India's Chandrayaan-1 in 2008 collected data with an orbiter and then crash landed at the lunar South Pole. And China in 2013 sent the moon goddess, Chang'e, and its rover Jade Rabbit, which didn't get very far. But that still exists as a site, an archaeological site on the moon. So that's just a few examples of what's on the moon. It's estimated there are over 250 metric tons of cultural material on the lunar surface today. There's lots of debris in space. Some of it's significant and some of it not. So we have a space heritage. We've created it beginning in the late 50s, and we have to decide how to evaluate it and preserve it.
Quick question, are the rest of the nations buying into this whole concept?
Well, the recommendations are for the U.S. They do not include. There is a section that we wrote that said the State Department should be involved in outreach and talking to other partners. I'm also involved in a group called For All Mankind, which is a group of international space lawyers, which is trying to get all teams commercially who are going to go to the moon to buy into the guidelines. But currently, no, there isn't. Yes?
Does NASA have any ongoing programs to plan on how to get rid of some of this space junk that's orbiting?
NASA does, several international agencies do too, but the cost and the experimental nature of it, it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. There's ideas
But
about
Although there
it's
are,
got to happen, right?
it's going to
Eventually?
happen, yeah, it has to happen because what happens now is I think we're thinking about when you have a mission, you have to figure out end of life. So where does this stuff end up afterwards? You know, with Mir, as it was just an amazing, archaeological artifact, if we can think of a space station as an archaeological artifact, the Russians all the time thought, we'll deorbit it, and it did crash land into the ocean around Australia. There are preservationists that think that was terrible. They should have pushed it into Lagrange Point and had it up there for tourists in the future. But they have to think about now, at the end of the mission, what happens to these things. And of course, with the deorbiting, chances are they're going to be deorbiting into the world's ocean, but that has to be planned at the beginning of the mission.
They are talking about having space robots go up there and actually capture these things
With
and
maps.
destroy them,
Yeah.
and sending them down in safe harbor, probably mostly in the ocean.
That'll be several, maybe a decade away.
Yeah, who knows? I think it's the focus on how much you can get politically behind these things, because it's a paint chip that took down one of our orbiters. So I mean, the shuttle, the whole thing. So I mean, these kind of things, you really need to clean them up in some sort of manner. Let me finish with two here, and then we can get in. This is Houston Mission Space Control, as most of you know, at the Johnson Space Center, and it's kind of unique. It's pretty much been like this for probably, I would say, well, it's been like this since the mid-60s. You can kind of tell. If you remember the famous apple green that the Navy always used to use and stuff, and a lot of the schools in San Diego became apple green interiors, because it's supposed to have a calming effect on everybody, including kids, haha. So, in any case, it's now was kind of being used for a tourist operation by special invite, and we had a special invite to go there. But underneath this is all of the current space operations, command centers and stuff that NASA's using. So they felt they had a real security problem if they're going to open it up. So we were there, and we were given a presentation by Eugene Kranz, of course. Failure is not an option. I'm sure that you remember the movie. and Glenn Looney, who was also on Apollo. Both of these were on Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. And one of the, let's go back just a second. And one of the unique things that we keep strapping with is, what do you do with all the old stuff? Now, somebody in NASA knew that this was an important site way back when. So all of the consoles that were lifted out of here, and all of the things that you normally would have back in the 60s, somebody saved those. They had put them in a warehouse and they saved them. They didn't throw them away as they got replacements. So now they're thinking, okay, let's go ahead and restore this, and we'll put it back together. And it was a big, big, big political fight. I can't tell you that we came that close, and one of the things that we found was that you can't give money to NASA. They cannot accept money to preserve things. So we created a nonprofit, and I asked my executive director at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, is there some way that we can do a pass-through from a federal agency to a federal agency? Then we're okay. So if we as a federal agency could give it to NASA, and they're only talking about $3 million. And I said, geez, you guys could get one of your contractors to come in and just write you a check for that overnight. So anyway, we found in our laws or whatever, for the first time, 20 years old thing that we could actually pass money. So we wrote a deal, and I had the opportunity again to meet with Gene Kranz and work this out and write the thing and all that, and we put our signatures on it, which was really great. And also meeting General Stafford, having a chance to meet him. He's the one that wrote the introduction to our book and stuff. So it's really been great. So this is going to be restored, and it's going to be up and running, and hopefully Kranz and Looney will be there to go through and kind of mock up the Apollo 11, including Gene says I can still fit into my old clothes. Now, one of the neat things that he said, there's only one woman that was on the floor during that time. And he said you could always know there was a crisis at Mission Control when you opened the door and walked into the room. And I'm not saying that your labs down below where you're fixing up the planes smell like this and everything else, but when you open up the door They're chain smoking, the cigarette ashtrays are this big, smoking pipes, burnt coffee on the stove, the smell of burnt coffee on the thing and everything else. And he says, you knew you had a crisis because once you had a crisis, they could not leave this space. Nobody could go out and do anything. Everybody had to be here. In fact, in the movie, Gene says, when we rescued finally Apollo 13, people don't jump up and shout and all that. They're still staying there, they're focused, they're trained and everything else. So there's a lot of liberties in terms of the movie, including trying to find, the carbon dioxide transfer to oxygen and all that sort of stuff. They didn't throw all that stuff on the table. They actually went through their books and started to look at stuff and figured out how to do it. And if you read the book, it's all in Kranz's book and stuff. So next. So I'm going to end with this because the importance of this is really these people that have the corporate image. And as you know, Armstrong is gone, of course. And these people that have this corporate memory and everything else is so important to get them while they're still alive and they have it. They don't have to remember dates and numbers and all that, but the experiences that were there. In fact, I recommended that during that time is to introduce these smells of burnt coffee and light up your cigarette. Because I think it's important for people when they visit these sites that they're thrown in this context that really throws you back to that particular period. And of course, I also had the pleasure of knowing Wally Schirra, which is great, and his wife Jo. I don't know if most of you probably know that Jo started the Astronauts Wives Club on this. I don't know whether you knew that or not. And when she passed away, after Wally, of course, passed away, she had her ashes sprinkled out here in the Pacific Ocean and also on Kauai, where they had a wonderful house on Kauai on this. So when you're meeting these people, you have to also think of the wives and the other people behind there, the support crew that you had, the staff that you had, and everything else. She was wonderful. She was swimming when she was in her 80s. She was a sun worshiper. And we know another person up at Sea Ranch that was like that, Larry Halpern's wife and stuff, dancing nude on the beach and all that kind of stuff. But again, that was the 60s. That was part of that culture, part of that life that was going there. So, and there's only 3 of the Project Mercury wives alive: Scott Carpenter's wife, Renee, John Glenn's Annie, and Gus Grissom's widow, Betty. And they're the only little survivors of Mercury 7. So this is where Lisa and Beth and I are coming from on this, is to capture these moments while we still remember them and try to preserve as much as we can for the future, because to me there's nothing worse than coming to a site with a rock and a plaque on it that says, on this site, we do lots of plaques, on this site and yada 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 this occurred, and the 4th grader looks up and sees a shopping center. Just doesn't get the message across. So thank you guys for inviting us.
Very nice.